So today we're talking about interview tips for attorneys and law students interviewing with law firms. It doesn't have to be that long of a presentation. It just goes over a lot of the major issues that people have in law firm interviews. And what I'll do is this is a live webinar. And so I will go through these interview tips. And then after I'm done, then I'll take a short break and then we can take questions. And certainly appreciate everyone being here today. It is getting ready for a kind of a holiday weekend. It's good to get this stuff and learning going right now, and we'll get started. So these are some questions here. First one is, what is the most important rule of thumb for law firm interviews? And these are some fun ones, but the first one I think is the way you dress in interviews. A lot of people go into interviews and don't dress well. It is important to show respect to the employer that you are excited about the job and take it seriously. And by dressing, whether it's a Zoom interview or it's an in-person interview, it does make a difference. And that really is an important thing. So I always recommend looking very good for interviews, even if the firm doesn't have any sort of dress code. It's just it's a way to show respect for the people interviewing you, and they typically do appreciate it. And so that is very helpful. Even if you're talking in your bedroom when you're interviewing someone, you still want to look good. The next thing is just giving concise answers. One thing that happens with attorneys when they're giving interviews, especially young attorneys, is they often want to talk and explain their success or explain what they've done that's good and brag or give insight into things that don't look so good. And most of the time, the people that are listening to you don't really care that much about it. They want to hire the best people they can, but giving long answers is not really appropriate. Like you really want other people to have control over the conversation, and you want them to do most of the talking. But there's a rule in interviewing that you want the other person to do, if possible, to do as much as 80% of the talking. And I know that sounds like an awful lot when you're reading an interview, but really you're almost there when you're interviewing to make the person you're talking to feel good about themselves, which is a hard thing to understand when you're going in and believing that you're interviewing with someone for a job. You want that person to feel good about themselves. So you make people feel good about themselves when you dress up for the interview and you look good, and that shows respect. And you also make them feel good about themselves when your answers are concise and direct and tell the information that they need without a lot of explanation. I want to give a little bit of insight into that, the giving concise answers. And it was funny, I had one of my mentors used to talk about how he was on a plane and he was sitting next to someone. And usually when he sat next to someone, nothing would happen, but he decided this time to sit next to someone and to try to let the person do all the talking. I guess it was a short or 2 or 3 hour flight or something. And so he sat next to them, and for the entire flight, he hardly talked about himself at all. And the other person did nothing but talk about themselves. And when the flight ended, the man that was talking about himself said, "This has been the most interesting conversation I've ever had. I really enjoyed meeting you," and all that sort of thing. So that's how people feel. When you let people talk about themselves, then that really makes them think positively about you. Now, you lead the conversation in a way that you're leading towards them feeling good about themselves, not negative, so you don't talk about negative things, but allowing people to talk about themselves and their firm and the job is really very important. And you allow people to interview, draw their own conclusions. For example, if you were trying to leave the impression that you're a very good athlete, I'm not saying that you would want to do this, but if you did, you might just talk about how you played different sports and things in college, or if you want people to think, you don't say I'm a good athlete, you allow people to draw conclusions based on what you say. Or if they ask you, are you busy? Then you say, yes, I billed 3,000 hours. I'm working for 25 partners. I just keep getting work. That gives people the conclusion that you're very busy. You don't talk about how I get in at 5 and I do all this, and you let people draw their own conclusions. And then one of the things that is very important also is you don't want to get into too much detail about the work that you do. You don't want to be condescending to the person and say, I'm not going to tell you that because it's privileged. And you just don't go into a lot of detail. A lot of attorneys, when they go into interviews, they say, I can't say that because it's confidential or it's privileged. And they don't even really understand the rules of that. You can always talk about things that are in public filings and that you may have filed, but you have to be careful about client confidences. But at the same time, you don't want to go into too much detail about your previous work. And also, it can bore people as well. You just need to be very careful about that. And when you're doing that, so just talk that you worked on this, you like this, I like this, that sort of thing. The other thing is your body language. Different types of people have different body language. And body language means that you might not make eye contact. It means that you might be looking, looking behind the person, making inappropriate faces, slouching, sitting up, all sorts of things. And people will notice that, and that has something to do with what you do. So typically, if you're thinking of a certain way, your body almost will show it, or your expressions will show it. So you have to be very aware of that when you go into interviews. Honesty is a big one. So a lot of times people, especially law students and others, will exaggerate, or they'll want to look like they're doing something better than they could have, or they were saying. So you really need to be very careful about lying or any type of misleading statements, or even trying to sound more qualified than you might otherwise be. Ultimately, and this is a big thing to understand, is when people are hiring you, they're not going to hire you because they think you can do something better than another person. They're really deep down, and this is a very important rule to understand. People are tribal in nature, so they're hiring you because they like you and because they think you'll fit in and work hard and help them. So anything that you do where you're trying to act like you're really special or great, that a lot of times will upset people. And if you do that, it will make them want to not like you. And so that's something to think about. So you need to be honest, but not brag. And when you're asked questions, people like vulnerable people. I once heard this guy talk, and he was saying, there's two versions of me. One is, I think he said, I went to Princeton. I was admitted when I was only 16. I was one of the youngest people ever admitted. And I not only that, but I made the varsity football team. I was in the best eating thing. I came out of school very young. I was admitted to the MBA program at Harvard without any work experience. And then I got a job and very quickly became a managing director at Goldman Sachs, where I was making $800,000 a year by the time this is the kind of stuff he was talking about. So he said, this is one version of me. And then he said, the other version of me is my mother died when I was, 4 years old. Father was actually working in a coal mine and supported me. And I had to take care of my sisters from the time I was young. And I'm actually dyslexic. I have a learning disability. And for my whole life, I've struggled with all these sorts of things. And so the one version of him it makes him sound like a superstar, but it's not necessarily the most likable. And the other version of him makes him seem like someone who somehow overcame all these odds to do something special. So sometimes being honest and vulnerable is a lot better than trying to look like you're something that you're not. And then the other one is being prepared. So a lot of times people will go into interviews and they won't be prepared. That means they won't be ready to talk about themselves. That means they may be tired. That means they act surprised by questions. They don't understand where they're interviewing. They ask dumb questions that they could easily have found. They don't understand the type of work that the firm's doing. So these are all things that you need to understand going into interviews. Now, one thing that I do want to bring up to everyone, and I do think this is an important point, is law firms have different types of hiring standards depending on the state of the economy. Right now, it's harder to get jobs for people than it was a year ago. And maybe a year from now, it'll be easier than it is now. It's just everything goes in cycles. When the economy is in a cycle where the law firms just need bodies, they will hire people without a lot of screening. Even the best and biggest firms, with lots of exceptions, but will hire people just because they need bodies. But when the economy when the jobs do get more competitive, being prepared is very important. They're no longer just interested in you because you went to a good law school or you are working at a big firm and have some experience. They're going to be more aggressive about screening. They're going to hire people that want the job and are willing to do that. And also being prepared and knowing what's on your resume is important. You just need to be very careful about that. One other thing that I always recommend, this is kind of a small point, but you do want to always, by being prepared, that means being ready to talk about anything that could possibly be talked about on your resume, or just being ready for that. And those are the biggest tips right now. But then in the third way, there's another one about tell me about yourself. Most people are uncomfortable with this, but it's a good way to make an impression. There's an article. I did think about this at one point and write a long article about it. It's on the Harrison Barnes website. But telling me about yourself, people are generally interested yourself. People are generally interested at that point in somehow you making a connection with them and them finding things that they may like about you that make you different than other people. So that is a way for people to understand if you're able to connect with others. And so tell me about yourself. If you lead with your honors or things that you've done, and then that's just going to give the impression that's all that's there. If you lead with things about you, where you live, what you like to do in your free time, your family, and why you went into the practice of law or why you like your practice area, that's a little bit more helpful for that answer. But again, think about the kinds of people that you like and how they would answer that question. What would they say? And how would you put yourself in a position where you're identifying, or where you're necessarily identifying with people and getting them to like you and respect you. So tell me about yourself isn't saying I like to, go out and get crazy 3 nights a week or something. Tell me about yourself is more about things that can make connections with other people and that will show whatever you think is important. Different people are wired in different ways. Some people are very social. Other people are very introverted. Other people are. So ideally what you would do is you would talk about whatever motivates you the most, whatever kind of aspects of that, and that would help you the most. So you want to also, if you can, describe yourself in a way that kind of talks a little bit about what you think is important in the firm. You don't want to lie. Law firms will obviously hire all sorts of people, and you don't want to perfectly match a job description, but you want to make sure that you're doing that well. What do you know about our firm? There's a lot of public information about firms now, so you should understand that. One thing I would really caution you to do, and this is very important, is not basing your conclusions or understanding of a firm based on online reviews. So we have reviews on our site. We have law firms all have reviews. I get emails from law firms daily asking us to take down reviews that are on various sites that we have, just as other websites that have reviews get tons of them. In most instances, when people leave reviews or that are negative about a firm, they're people that were fired, that did something wrong, that had problems, that who knows. And so just because people had a bad experience at a firm doesn't mean you'll have a bad experience. And just because that firm may be very difficult to work at in one practice area doesn't mean it's going to be difficult in another practice area. So reviews are not something that you should necessarily base your opinions about a firm on, because if you think something negative about a firm going into the interview, you're going to show it if you think that. And people get sidetracked with negative reviews and stuff all the time. And then when they do see the negative reviews, they ask questions about it in the interview, and then it just shoots them out of the water. You should not pay very much attention to reviews, including necessarily positive ones, because positive ones can change too. You just need to understand how you'll fit in there. So one thing to understand too, when you look at what you're reading about a law firm online, is just remember that certain organizations like certain types of people. So certain organizations may be very collegiate in nature, meaning if you work there, you're expected to be part of the group and have fun and go out with people. And that's really maybe they're emphasizing that more than working hard and the quality of the work, which is okay. There's just different types of firms. Other firms are very liberal in nature, where everything's discussed and debated. So just because and again, there's probably hundreds of little subgroups I could talk about in terms of cultures of firms, but just because one person doesn't do well in one culture doesn't mean another person won't go there and thrive. And so those are things you need to understand. So researching that and then learning about the philosophy and success and so forth probably will help you a little bit. Researching firms before the interview, this is just stuff you already know, so I'm not going to go into too much about that. Researching firms' weaknesses, I'm asked to talk about your weaknesses. These are kinds of questions that I don't really like. Some people to answer them, and I don't know why. I think that a more casual approach to interviewing is fine, but if you're asked to address your weaknesses, you may be asked what they are, or you may be asked about them in the interview itself, things that stick out on your resume that are weaknesses or things that are important to understand. So the biggest thing to to really give people the impression of is everybody makes mistakes. Everybody has weaknesses. It's what we do with those weaknesses that are important. If you go to a firm that doesn't matter, if you did something wrong in the past, you have to explain why that happened. If you learn from it, but you have to make sure that you put everything in a positive spin if you're asked about them. Now, if you're asked to talk about your current weaknesses, that would be things like I work too hard, or I feel like things that give an impression that you're going to be a very good employee wherever you go, and then will make people like you and think highly of you. But the weaknesses is not something that you need to worry usually too much about. Most law firms will not ask you that. And then again, people will often ask inappropriate questions. They do much less frequently than they do right now, than they used to. And people will ask all sorts of inappropriate questions in interviews. They may ask you about your marriage, your family, your politics. My best advice for you with that is one thing you could do is ask how it's related to the job. But generally, what I like to do when people ask those sorts of questions, I have noticed that often the best response to that, and I'll just give my 2 cents, is often to answer it, or if you don't want to completely answer it indirectly, if you say that's inappropriate, then you're going to upset the person. You might not get a job. So it's up to you how you want to address that. You may want to note it in the future, or if you get an offer, you may want to say something about it, but you have to be very careful about inappropriate questions because people will ask them all the time. I don't know why they do, but sometimes they're just not thinking, or they're just curious, or I don't know. But political questions, you have to judge the person. So sometimes people will be on one side or the other, and you may be on the same side. And if you start talking about politics and it's a match, they'll immediately like you. But another way to answer a political question might just be to say, I'm here trying to get the job. I don't know which way you're going. And if I'm not going that way, I might go back to the job or something. You want to kind of think about that. But the best interviewers typically will have the ability to not take that too seriously. And so a lot of lawyers, by the way, are adversarial. Sometimes people will go into interviews and be very confrontational with the people that they're interviewing. And that's just not a good way of doing things. I was talking to some people from a top 5 law school, and they were talking about the dean interviewing people that came in for interviews, and they were having a really hard time hiring because he would go and review everything that they'd ever written and then question about them. And most law firms that are going to be very adversarial with you in interviews are probably not the best places to work. Most attorneys that are very adversarial when they interview you often are having problems themselves in the job. And this has just been my experience over watching this for a quarter century or more. So I believe that one of the most important things that you can do is just when you're interviewing with law firms is just to, if someone's very adversarial with you, then just respond in a way that you think shows you have the ability to think and not necessarily, you don't have to win the argument. Winning an argument in an interview may upset the person you're interviewing with. You need to be very careful. And then summarizing your background, if they're asking you to summarize your legal background, that should be fairly simple. For experienced attorneys, it can be very difficult, but what I would recommend is just talking a little bit about your practice area, the types of experience you've had, leaving it at that. Okay, and then underqualified attorneys. So a lot of people are underqualified for different jobs. Sometimes people are interviewed that maybe shouldn't be interviewed for jobs, but then they end up getting the job. In most cases, when you do get an interview with a law firm, the law firm is interviewing you because they want to hire you. They don't want to bring in people that they believe are not people that they should hire. They typically do want to hire people that they interview. If you feel like you're unqualified for whoever you're interviewing, you may believe you're unqualified, but maybe the law firm is having a hard time finding people, or maybe the law firm wants to bring in someone like you. If you are unqualified for the job and you think that people are asking you questions that are going to make it look like you're unqualified, typically, then you would go and stress your ability to learn and improve and that sort of thing. You don't want to be dishonest. Thank you notes are very difficult. When law firms interview our candidates, we always call up and thank the firm after, and then we talk to the candidate. A lot of times people will send thank you notes. I've gotten people jobs before by having them write very good thank you notes when it looked like they weren't going to get the job. But I do believe that as a general rule, writing thank you notes can sometimes backfire, even the best thank you notes. I don't know why. I've been in too many heard too many people make typos in thank you notes or do something, say something that the people didn't like in a thank you note. So it's always good to be careful, I think, with the thank you notes. It also can make you look sometimes a little desperate. Law firms, by the way, don't like desperate candidates. They want to feel like you have a lot of options. But if you think it's a good fit, you can make that clear. But so thank you notes can often make you look desperate. I've written a lot of articles about thank you notes. There's a lot of stuff out there, but typically I do recommend probably not doing them unless you have had a very good experience with them in the past. And sometimes if you come across as someone that in person that may not be as likable or enthusiastic or I don't know, but then and letting the people know that you really appreciated the chance to interview and really think highly of them can often be a game changer. I had an instance once where I interviewed someone for, I think it was like a CFO type job. And he came in and he'd been he had a lot of experience like running companies that were larger than mine at the time. But he was old. He was in his 70s but very polished and very excited to be getting the interview and very qualified. But talked to him and I was like, I don't really understand this. You've been a CFO at a close to maybe a public company. I don't know what you're doing here. And I felt like he was probably way beyond anybody that would ever want to come work at our company. So I went through the interview. But then when I was done with the interview, he came up, he stood up and he walked towards my desk and he said, I just want you to know that this job would mean a lot to me and it would be very important to me to do this job. And I would do a great job for you. And that really struck me as, wow, someone really, this kind of person really wants to work for me. And I didn't understand at the time, but the company was growing very fast and it would have been a good opportunity for him, but I didn't listen to that. Instead, I hired someone that was much younger and then didn't really want the job. And then I eventually had to fire for not coming into the office in a normal time. And then I found out all these different problems. And then the person got in trouble with their next job and the next one after that because I read about it in the paper. So the point is that making people think that you really want something and it would mean a lot to you and you'd appreciate it can really go a long way. And you can do that in the letter if you're enthusiastic, if you come across properly. And again, it's all about chemistry. You have to understand the right time to do it. But this older attorney, an older CFO candidate that did that with me, that was a very smart thing he did. And I often thought about that because had I hired that person, it probably would have been a really good move. But thank you notes can often hurt you. Now, there are certain people that you may want to thank when you're done with an interview. One of the things I've noticed about people that are very good at getting hired, and I don't know what it is, but there's a lot of people involved in bringing you into a firm. So you have the recruiting department, for example. HR is often the one, and that's the recruiting coordinator inside of a firm. That is the one that typically is getting all these resumes all day and has to sort through them and figure out who's the most qualified for the job. And then they often have to go to bat for the attorneys that are looking for people saying, this is the best applicant we got, or this person may not be the best applicant, but I like them. So there's people behind the scenes helping you that may not even know about, and you may even start at a new firm and never even know that person was there. Sometimes I do believe that if you've had a good interaction with the HR department, then I think thanking them is often very smart. They're often the ones that actually determine if you get an interview and get hired, or you would never realize that sometimes they get complete authority to bring in people. So you have to be, and a lot of times they're attorneys. So you have to understand and thank them. And that often goes a long way because people typically don't. They think, who do I think's helping me? Oh, I think the attorney's helping me. Often that's just not the case. So the other thing is that the HR department's helping you and thanking people like the receptionist on your way on, being really nice to them. And just all these sorts of people that you can thank can be very useful. Is an attorney that's a head of a practice group going to care about a thank you note? Maybe just sending them a note saying, I appreciate talking to you. I think I could make a real contribution. I really like your firm. I've always liked it, blah, blah, blah. That can be helpful. But other than that, you have to be careful. Okay, bad interviews. Has bad interviews. Sometimes people don't even know they had a bad interview. Other times it looks like you've had a bad interview. And just don't worry about it if you had a bad interview. The most important thing you can do is learn. Sometimes you have a bad interview just because the firm is not a good fit for you, or there's something about the job that's not good, or maybe you don't even want to practice law anymore. Who knows? You just never know. But if you have a bad interview, I really wouldn't worry too much about it and just do better in your next interview. One of the tests, by the way, one of the reasons that interviews are important, I think, in a lot of respects, is when you're a lawyer. Traditionally, lawyers have had to stand in front of clients and make a client's argument, or stand in front of a court and make a client's argument and make it to the other side. And so being able to be up, meaning focused and doing well and persuasive, is important. And so it's important for all types of attorneys. You have to look like you have a lot of value and you can give value. So you always want to think about that when you go into interviews. And preparation means being prepared just like a client would be. A client, if you were representing a client, you would learn everything you possibly could about the client before representing them. And that's very important. I've been represented before by some very good attorneys. And a couple of times, like I remember, like one of the best attorneys I ever had represent me in something, I called up and tried to schedule a call with a person and I had to wait. And then when I finally had the call, the person knew all about my business and everything. And it wasn't because they were familiar with it. It was because they'd had a lot of research and stuff done about this case I was involved in and things before they even spoke to me, which I was pretty amazed by because I didn't even offer that information. That could be helpful. And then there's just lots of ways to screw up interviews. These are some of the more common ways. One of the showing up late always is something that's just a real problem. People that show up late for interviews, it just sets things up on the wrong path. Most people that show up late for interviews, by the way, do not end up working out. I don't know why that is, but you do want to show up on time. You need to understand whatever city you're in, the traffic, get there early, everything you can do to be on time. You cannot criticize your last employer, your last job. I was talking at one point to, I don't know if I told this story last week, but it's funny. I had a attorney that was a right-hand attorney of this very famous attorney that was all over the national press, like the Wall Street Journal, for being caught doing a lot of bad stuff. Actually, I'll just tell you, because there's a lot of attorneys that were working for this attorney, but Michael Avenatti, the guy that was representing, the woman that sued Trump and all this, he was involved in trying to rip off Nike. And anyway, so this guy was working for Michael Avenatti, and I was talking to him, and he'd been working for him for a long time. And obviously he knew he was going to have to leave because there was all the problems, and hadn't been paid in months. And it was just very funny. It wasn't funny, but what was funny was how positive this guy was and how he never said anything at all negative about his boss, the guy he was working for, who was literally lying. And on the front page of the newspaper is just probably the biggest scumbag attorney of all time. Never said anything negative about him to me or to any of the firms that interviewed him. It was comical. And it wasn't because he didn't think the bad things. He just didn't want to go there. And I thought that was very interesting. And very classy, by the way. People that criticize others and their former employers, you just have to it's just not a place you want to go. You may want to say, I'm looking for different opportunities, but you don't want to go there. And because if you do that, then law firms are going to assume that you're going to do the same things. Criticizing bosses, criticizing former employees, talking about how the firm is disorganized or they're bad people there, the attorneys are bad, all that sort of stuff is negative and it's going to hurt you. And I noticed that with partners as well. Like partners will say, oh, all the associates here are terrible, or the management is horrible, they don't know what they're doing, or this or this. And so these types of attorneys, it's just not a good idea to ever do that. And attorneys that do that usually, I watch it because I talk to them and they never end up having long-term success. And they're usually gone pretty quickly, and it's very difficult for other people to hire them. People do not share your lack of enthusiasm, and they don't want to hear negative information. They just, if your last firm is having problems and goes out of business, you can say they went out of business. And if they ask you why you're leaving, you can say there's a lot of things that they're doing very well, and this is what I like about the firm, but you don't want to ever criticize your employer. I know it's hard to do, especially a lot of times people are very angry at their employer. Their employer has let them down. There's all sorts of reasons, but you need to be very careful. And then arrogance, again, People want to hire people that like them, and you do not want to appear and like you're better than the people you are. They won't like that. And then again, I talked about lying earlier. Another common question is, are you interviewing anywhere else? Why are you leaving your present position, or why did you leave your current position? And how do you address that, especially if you parted on bad terms? Again, never say anything negative about your own firm. And I talked about that. And then, but one of the things you can talk about if people ask you why you're leaving, typically there's lots of reasons for moving. So many times people are at a small firm and want to move to a larger firm and get more responsibility. Other times or work on larger matters. Other times people are at a big firm and want to move to a smaller firm where they can get more responsibility or bring in clients. So typically you just need to think about what things can you do someplace else potentially that you can't do at your existing firm. And most of the reasons for moving, by the way, are about more opportunity, more work, more responsibility, more long-term growth potential, all those sorts of things. And so you typically, all you need to do, you could be at the largest firm in the world. And if you're moving to a smaller firm, just say, I want to go to a smaller firm where there's more opportunity, or where I can work on my own cases or matters. And that's often really the ways to answer those sorts of questions. And when law firms ask you if you're interviewing anywhere else, you often can say things like, I'm just starting the process. I just applied here if you are, or I'm interviewing with a couple other places right now. You have to be very careful about that, because if law firms ask you where else you're interviewing or what other firms you're talking to, that to me is not a good idea to answer that. So that can many times hurt you, but you have to be very careful. So why can that hurt you if you talk about if you're interviewing with anywhere else? If you're interviewing at a mid-sized firm that pays, I don't know, $100,000 a year, and then you interview at a major firm that pays $300,000 a year, and the mid-sized firm asks you where else you're interviewing, you say the firm that's paying $300,000 a year, that's going to make them deflate them right away. It's going to make them feel like they shouldn't have anything. Why would they even talk to you? Why are you, if you're interested in something like that, why would you be interviewing with us? You may think that you're able to look like a big deal to the interviewer, but that's not. That's just, you basically cost yourself a job. If you say you're interviewing in other cities, that's going to make them wonder what's going on. If you say that you're interviewing at a big firm and you say you're interviewing a small firm, that's going to make them wonder. If you're interviewing in-house and you're interviewing a law firm, that's going to make them think you're going to want to go in-house. You have to be very careful. Interviewing anywhere else basically means, are you interviewing with any similar firms? And if you tell them a similar firm, similar to them, same size, same mid-sized, another mid-sized firm, then that'll give them the opportunity to say why they're better and criticize the other firm or whatever, which they do sometimes, or it will give them the opportunity to see that you're doing something similar. So you typically need to be very careful with that question. You just don't want to disqualify yourself. How did you do in law school? That's an okay question. They typically will have your transcript. So you can, if you're welcome to say you did okay or whatever, but I don't think it's that important of a question. Again, most law firms are not going to be that concerned with this. They do ask for your transcript, and for summer associates, it's sometimes important, but it depends on the size firm and the market you're in. Close, we talked about that earlier. You don't want to dress down too much for interviews, just keep that. The other thing to understand when you're an attorney interviewing for a job, it's different than, I've been seeing all these pictures this week and articles about the Sam Bankman-Fried, who I guess the FTX collapse, and they're all talking about how he wears shorts and t-shirts and how it's so cool and people liked it. But he's like an entrepreneur. And when you're an attorney, I'm sure his attorneys that represent him are all dressed up. When you watch his attorneys going into court, they're all dressed up and they look very professional. And attorneys are representing other people, so they need to look the best. And so it may not mean that you have to dress up when you're in the office or at home, but you certainly do want to look good in the interviews. I talked about that earlier. Again, this is just some things. If you're shy, you don't have to appear confident when you're nervous. Law firms have all sorts of different types of people working for them, but you certainly do want to try to connect with other people in interviews. If you're very shy, you want to work on things like smiling, being interested in other people, and really do your best. In most practice areas, not all, do need to be able to relate to other people. And so being a shy attorney is okay, but you may need to worry a little bit about the kind of attorneys, the practice setting you're in. There's nothing wrong with being shy. There's nothing wrong with being withdrawn, but you have to be in the right practice areas. I had an interesting interaction not too long ago with someone that was working for me. And at the time, there was all this drama going on in with people that they were working with. And this person said, I try not to get involved in a lot of this stuff. I just like to put my head down at work. And so if you're shy, one way to get around that is to just leave people with the impression that you're a very hard worker. You try not to get involved in office politics and so forth, but you really enjoy practicing law or whatever practice area you're in. And this is just some other thing. Nervous, you have to be careful about that. There are people that do things like, I was interviewing once with an attorney that had at one point been a partner, head of a major U.S. law firm, and lost his job in a scandal, and then was off for several years, and then was trying to get back into the profession. And I was talking to him and realized that he chewed off part of his lip. He now is at another big firm because it was a nervous habit. People do all sorts of things. There was another thing that was funny. I used to work with a girl. My first job, she was an attorney, and then she went to the U.S. Attorney's office and was prosecuting this big case. And it was on one of these police shows or these kind of real life shows where they were talking about all this work she'd done as a U.S. attorney. I think it was someone that was making fake money or something. It was funny, the show. But what the producer did is, because she had this habit where she'd always be playing with her nails and her cuticles and things. And so while she was talking, I couldn't believe it, the camera. And I was like, oh, this is someone I used to know very well. It's a star of this 2020 episode or whatever it was. And just focused on her fingers and showed all the damage she'd done by picking at them. So the point is, these nervous behaviors, which are things like, it could be fidgeting, it could be picking things, it could be the way you talk. A lot of times people say, or does that make sense? And just these kind of nervous signs you really want to work on, because it makes people nervous. And it's just, you need to be careful. And then just getting too relaxed in interviews, which would be talking about a lot of personal details or things, is very dangerous. People, even if you feel like you're in a position where now you can be comfortable around someone, that does not work. Sometimes people will do dumb things. I've seen even recently people being asked to smoke if they want to have a cigarette, and they do. No one smokes anymore, but just things like that. And then other things. So you need to be very careful. Never get too personal in the interview. Extremely careful with that. And then big firm versus mid-sized firms. Mid-sized firms, and anytime you're interviewing with a large major law firm, most major law firms assume you want to be there because they pay a lot and they're prestigious. But as you go down to smaller firms, they're often burned by people. So people go to work there, and because the compensation and the prestige isn't as high, they lose people. And so they really want to know that you're committed to them and you like them, and that's the kind of place that you want to work. If they don't get that impression, then they're not going to hire you. Big firms can understand just by the kinds of people that work there. They're looking for certain types of people. They need people. They have a lot of work. So just different types of places. But anytime you're interviewing with someplace it's not a major firm, you have to show them that you're sold on what they're offering, and to be able to do that fairly quickly. Otherwise, they're not going to like you. I have had lots of instances when I was young where I interviewed with smaller firms that knew I wouldn't want to go to work there, and it didn't work out. So you have to be very careful. And there were firms I would have liked to have worked at. I just wasn't able to connect properly. And then there's just some differences here. There's interviews with associates and junior partners and senior associates and partners. There's a lot of articles I've written about this, but typically when you're interviewing with people your own age or around your own age, meaning in terms of your experience level. So if you're a first year interviewing with another first year, they're just concerned with that you're someone that they like, that you seem like you would work hard and work with them and not try to look like you're better than them, or make sure they're not threatened by you. So that's important. You don't want to be threatened. And then junior partners a lot of times want to be, and then more senior associates are going to be people that you're going to be working for, and especially in large law firms and even mid-levels if you're a junior. So senior associates are going to want to hire you, or want people that are going to work hard and make them feel like they're very important. And the same thing goes with junior partners. They like people that make them feel important and like they're going to follow instructions and help them on their careers. So they need people that are good working for them, that take things seriously. Other associates want to, like people that your age, are going to want people that are that like them and they feel are connecting with them and could be their friend and they're not threatened by. And then typically partners and also senior associates and many times junior partners as well are looking for people that are going to work very hard. You need to really give that impression that you're going to work hard, that the job's important to you, that the firm's important to you. And this is really something that you may want to do. You can also act even more competitive give the impression to partners and junior partners that you're very competitive because they want to channel that competitiveness into hours. But the associates do not want to see the most competitive people in the world because that means that it's a threat to them. And then, older partners like competition. They want people that are hungry. They may be concerned about grades, that they're hiring the best people. But again, your ability to work hard is important. And then law firms often do interviews in unconventional situations. Sometimes there'll be lunch interviews. Other times they may do even a dinner interview. Sometimes they will interview you at a Starbucks or something during lunch. There's just all sorts of things that can happen with interviews. And then, of course, there's lots of Zoom interviews and phone interviews. But one of the things is when I've seen a lot of people make mistakes is they will go out to an interview and have too much to drink. A lot of times there are partners that will go out and at dinner and have 5 or 6 drinks regularly, and all of them, but I've certainly been with people that do that. You cannot do the same thing. So if someone with you in is having a bunch of drinks, you can't do the same thing. You have to basically stop. And the same thing goes with lunch interviews. You really do not want to ever have a second drink or anything. You just need to be very careful. It's not that there's anything wrong with this and I'm judging it. It's just that it can make it look like you have bad judgment. You also want to eat at the same pace. You don't want to be careful about what you order, and you just want to not order things that are the most expensive, or you understand what I'm saying. And then during the conversations at the lunch or the dinner, you want to be careful as well and be very respectful to the servers and nice to people, never get upset, and just be very careful. And again, the reason for unconventional interviews a lot of times is they're testing your ability to do small talk. They're testing your ability to just get along in kind of an informal place. And then they're testing your ability to ask other people questions and be polite. And that's about it. This is video conferences and telephone interviews. A lot of times, obviously, Zoom is extremely common. So people do that all the time. And as a matter of fact, I think they're actually, especially for screening interviews, much more common than just regular interviews. In those interviews, you always want to, of course, be on time. People are late to those now for some reason, but you always want to be on time. You want to look at the camera when you're talking. So you're making eye contact. You want to smile. You want to give direct answers and be prepared. Keep in mind also that your background is something that people notice. So they can see your background. And if your background looks overly nice or not, there's all sorts of things that your background's communicating as well. So you need to be careful about that and just kind of what you're showing. But yeah. And then asking questions is very important. You certainly do not want to ask dumb questions, but if you have very good questions, that's very good. Typically, the sorts of questions that you want to ask are always going to be related to what is the biggest challenge of the job, what's most important, what would you see my first 60 days looking like? Those are the most important questions. And you can generally get a sense right away if it's the kind of place you'd like to work. How quickly are you making your decision? Sometimes people ask that. There's nothing wrong with that. What does success look like to you? Why do you need someone in this job? What would it look like what would success look like to you if 6 months from now, if I'd started this job tomorrow? Those sorts of things. So asking people to future pace and think about what your responsibilities would be like, or what would make you do a good job? What would be the most important things to do? What do you think the mistakes people have made in this job, or what do you think people have done well in this job in the past, and what would you like to see more of? All those sorts of questions are very important. You can ask those in all interviews, but showing that you're thinking about how to do the job well, how to be very good at it is very important. And what are the things that you would warn people about or mistakes people make that you would like to see not repeated? Just anything that shows that you're very good. You should never, or concerned about the job, you should never ask about salary, vacation hours, remote, starting date, all sorts of things. Just remember that all these questions All you're doing when you ask them, you have the ability after getting hired to ask all these questions. So there's no reason to even ask them. If people say, do you want to know about the salary? You can say, I'd like to know about it at some point, but I'm more concerned about the work I do first. And that would really go over well. Would you like to know about vacation time? Yes, but I tend to work even when I'm on vacation. So I'm happy to know about it. Giving the right answers is very important. You don't want to ask about the start date either. You can sometimes ask how soon could I start if I'm hired, or when are you looking for someone, but I don't recommend that. You should never ask about the time you need to be in the office. All these sorts of questions, when you start asking about those, what you're doing is you're taking back the power from the employer. And the employer wants to feel like they're in control, especially at the interview point. And employer wants to feel like they have control over the vacation. They want to feel the control. So let them feel that's perfectly fine. Obviously, if someone's going to commit to pay you hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, then that's a form of control that you're going to have. But at the same time, you have to let this stuff go. You don't want to ask about working remotely. You don't want to ask about how many days of the week you need to be in the office, because just remember, every job that you're interviewing with is going to have multiple applicants. And these are things that people ask that end up getting them disqualified from jobs. So just don't do it. You have to wait to ask them later. Again, every employer has lots of options for people to hire. Now, some of them don't. Some people, I've had firms that are in the middle of nowhere, meaning they're desert somewhere. It's hard to hire people. In most firms, it's not that hard. So you need to make sure you try not to ask these questions. I understand that they're important to you, and they should be. But honestly, most stuff is negotiable. Salary is negotiable. Vacation time can be negotiable. All this stuff could be negotiable later. And so the time to really start thinking about this is after you get the offer. Your job in any interview is to go in to get the offer. And any reservations you express at the interview stage is insane. Why would you foreclose those options before you get an interview? You don't know what could happen. You could walk in from an interview that went poorly because you asked all these questions and lose your job a week from now, or the firm could go out of business or something. You don't know. So you just have to be careful. If you feel like the firm isn't a good place for you to work after you get the offer and you feel like there's things that you don't like about it, then deal with it then. Or if you just know you're not going to work there right when you're interviewing, then don't do it. There's one quick question I always counsel all my candidates never to ask about compensation in interviews. And I'll tell you one quick story. I love this story just because first of all, it's true. And second of all, and not that it wouldn't be true, but it's hard to believe the story I'm about to tell you. But I had a girl that was working for me for a kind of basically a writer, writing little news articles about law firms and things. And I found out at some point that she had worked at a major law firm, like a big New York law firm. And I was like, why is she interviewing at this? Why is she working in this job for us? And then she'd gone to a really good law school, and she was living in the South somewhere with her sister in a small apartment. And I told her, with this kind of record, you should start looking for jobs. And she was the kind of person that had a really bad experience in a major law firm. I think what had happened to her was she had been working for so many, it's a bad story, but she'd been working for so many hours at her firm and basically not allowed to leave because, that one of her eyes, something like exploded, and she rushed to the ER. And then anyways, the firm called her parents saying she wasn't there and if she didn't come to the office. But the point is that she had a really bad experience. And so after that, sometimes she quit and then it was been past several years kind of off the grid. I got her some interviews in California with a big firm. She went into not big firms, in small firms, because she'd been unemployed for so long. And she went into this one firm and interviewed, and she didn't think she'd ever get a job, or not she'd ever work there, because the firm was it was in an office park and wasn't very nice. And the people she was interviewing with, she was used to working in a big New York firm, all dressed in shorts and all that kind of thing. And so she didn't think it. And so after the interview, I called the firm. I was like, how did it go? And they said, we think it went, it was one person running the firm. He said, I think it went okay, but I don't think she liked us very much. And she didn't seem that enthusiastic. And I called her and I said, what's the problem? And did you like the firm? And she said, yeah, but I don't think they could afford to pay me even as much as you're paying me, which was $20 an hour. So anyways, I called the firm and I said, well, yeah, she did like it, but she was concerned about what the pay would be. And the partner said she would be making half of what she bills out. That's how I pay everyone that works for me. And she would bill out at that time, I think it was $500 an hour. So she would make $250 an hour working here. And so her first year, she made an awful lot of money. Like She was used to working like 3,000 plus hours a year. And at this firm, I think she worked a couple thousand. So completely changed her life. And she didn't ask about salary. But you just don't know about salary. It can always be negotiable. And even to this day, I haven't seen one from her in a couple of years, but I used to get Christmas cards and things from her every year. She was very happy about that. So a lot of times firms will surprise you with salary. You don't need to ask about it. And you don't want to ever express reservations. And if you have reservations, you can always deal with it later. And these are just some articles I've written about interviews. There's a bunch of them there online. You can always find those. I've written books and stuff too, but I don't really find those as well. So that's about it. I'm going to take a quick break just for a minute or two. And then when I come back, I can take questions about this or anything else you have questions about. Thanks. Will we get a PDF transcript of this presentation? Yeah, the transcripts are always uploaded for the webinars after. Sometimes it takes a while because we have to go through and edit them. But yeah, we do definitely edit the transcripts. Next question. Some people put their names, so I'm not going to type your name for the question on the screen, but I'll just, how do I answer the question of what your practice area if I'm not currently practicing, but in law school and teaching law at the same time? So if a law firm is asking you your practice area, the practice area, by the way, is very important for your choice of what the types of jobs you're applying for, especially if you're a law student. So law students, if you're a law student right now, corporate is probably slowing down. So you may want to start expressing interest in other practice areas like litigation, for example. But typically when the economy is doing very well, then corporate is a good practice area. So if you're in law school and people are asking you your preferred practice area, most of the time the law firms will ask you what you're interested in. You're not expected to make a decision about that right now in terms of what practice area is. Even if you're teaching law and you're in law school, you're not expected to make a decision about that. One thing I try to always tell people, and this isn't not something that you need to think about too much at the moment, but there's kind of two types of practice areas. There's transactional and there's transactional. And there's like litigation. And then there's science disciplines, but transactional and science discipline, science IP type stuff. But transactional is going to be your like corporate, real estate, tax, things along those lines. And then your litigation is exactly what it sounds like. It's like litigation, like things where writing is involved. It could be environmental or other things. So the big thing to understand is a young attorney or anybody that doesn't have a lot of experience, and this could be patent prosecution for the most part, and someone with a scientific background. People that are interested in transactional practice areas are typically people that are naturally inclined to do math and science. And then people that do litigation are typically things like English, political science, that kind of languages. And then this would just be math, same thing. So these are how the practice areas work. There's a bunch of different ones, obviously, but when you're trying to decide on a practice area, if you write down that you're interested and you want to do, say, like anytime you write down a practice, you have to be very careful when a law firm, especially when you're a law student, is asking you what practice area you're in. You're better off saying, I'm interested in transactional practice areas. I'm interested in things to do with litigation. Because if you say I'm interested in transactional and you say I'm interested in secured finance or something, then the law firm doesn't do that, or they don't have any openings, that's going to create problems. So I typically just recommend you say I'm interested in transactional or litigation, or if you're interested in patent prosecution, that would be, you talk about patent prosecution. One thing I talk about every week, and I'll talk about it again this week, but I typically rank firms and candidates between 1 to 5. There's nothing positive or negative about this either way. This would be consumer-facing firms and candidates that with low budgets, meaning the consumers do not have a lot of money to spend, and the firms cannot pay the attorneys working there very much. And then you have 5, which typically is large firms with huge clients with huge budgets. That's how to think about that. And then in between and then this might be your typical AmLaw 200 law firm right here, or AmLaw typical 100, AmLaw 100 larger firm. And then this is going to be like mid-sized, so forth. And then this could be small business. So the type of firm you work for will also often determine type of practice area you should be in. Typically, if you are coming out of a really good law school, you would go to a 3 or 4 firm. And if you did exceptionally well at a really good law school, you would go to a 5 firm maybe. 5 jobs are very hard to get, but those are the best ones typically. And the 4 firms typically pay as much, or a major firm. And then as you go down kind of the line here in terms of to the ones, these are smaller firms that are more welcoming to different types of people where you'd be doing consumer facing work. And there's nothing wrong with doing consumer facing work. You can certainly move from a 1 to a 4 and stuff, but these practice areas are always going to be a little bit different than the practice areas that a 5 firm would do. 5 firms are going to do different types of work. If they do litigation, it's going to be major litigation. If they do litigation in a 1 firm, it's going to be smaller type matters. Understanding the type of practice area you should be doing is often going to come down to a lot of different things. It'll come down to the law firm you're in or the type of law school you're doing. And again, or law school you went to and how well you did there. So there's nothing wrong with going. If you go to a really like a commuter school and you do really well there, you could theoretically get a job in a 5 firm. If you go and sometimes people will work in these different firms, there's really no reason that you wouldn't. It's just that's how it works. Okay, let's see here. So and if you have follow-up questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. I realize it may not have been the best answer. Let's see here. Okay, what are some of the topics of bringing up during an interview? Okay, so the topics would be things that are too personal, which could be religion, politics, sex, health, sex, health, just things that may make people uncomfortable and things that will allow people to reach conclusions about you that may be positive or negative. If you watch the news, people are obviously very passionate about politics, about being a Republican or a Democrat, and they literally hate each other. And not all of them do, but a lot of them do. So that there's a lot of things there. So why would you bring up your politics in an interview? I don't know, but if you do, it could hurt you. If you bring up your views in an interview, people again have things about that some people dislike people of different religions. I think so. Again, you don't want to do that. Same thing with sexuality, and there's a lot of animosity about that and so people that if you bring up having health problems, that could hurt you because people will typically think that maybe you can't, there's something wrong with you and you can't do the job, even if it's not relevant. And I'm trying to think health could be you've committed mistakes, getting fired, dumb things you've done. I don't know, just being careful in interviews, some of the things you want to avoid bringing up. But typically the things that I would just say are anything where people are on 2 different sides or the interviewer could be on a different side of something. So if you say, I hate people that like sports and they like sports, it's not obviously going to be a good thing. So anything that's going to put people on one side of the fence. Now, a lot of this stuff, by the way, I'm just going to say this, and I probably shouldn't, but people will always put the stuff on their resume. They'll put all sorts of stuff about their religion on their resume. Is it okay? I personally think it is, but at the same time, it can hurt you in some aspects if you're applying to certain places, because there are people that, I don't make the rules or don't control everyone's thought. They may not like that. There's people that just, whatever. If you put things about politics on your resume, just think about how much animosity there is about religion. Kanye West getting in trouble. Who knows? And then you have politics. Think about what's going on with there. Every day people hate each other because of that in the papers. Same thing with sexuality. And it's just a lot. Health and crimes. So anything that puts people on one side of something is really to be avoided. Even if you think the interviewer might agree with you, it's still things you shouldn't put on there because it's just not, or talk about, it's just not the best judgment. And it can make things many times much more difficult for you than it would otherwise be. I've seen people that, anyway, regardless of what side of the fence you're on with any of these issues, bringing them up in an interview can definitely do you some harm. Now, it's not to say that it can't help you in certain places, because sometimes if you're very left-wing or right-wing and you're interviewing with a firm like that, they may actually like that resume, but not always. If I feel the interview is not going well, is there a way to steer it in a more positive direction if I really want the job? So a lot of times the interviews will go poorly when the interviewer sometimes, you can't control the person interviewing you, but a lot of times interviewers will steer things in a negative direction or bring up things in your background. I personally don't think that's a good idea. I think the best interviewers often won't do that, but if they do bring up a lot of tough questions and it's not negative, you always want to just basically put a positive spin on stuff. So if you're asked what you did, I don't know, if you start talking about something that isn't going or didn't go well for you in a previous job, or I don't know what it would be, but or if the interview is not going well, and put it in a positive direction if you really want the job, then you can say I really think there's a lot of good things about this job for me. I've learned from my mistakes. I'm hungrier, whatever it is, and really steer things in those directions. There's always, and this is just out of having done this and counseled people for the past several years or quarter century. These are the questions that every interviewer is asking themselves. These are the main questions. So can you do the job basically means, do you have the ability to do the job? And that pretty much usually comes through on your resume. So by the time someone brings you in to interview, then they're going to know whether or not you can do the job. But you can certainly, there's different things they may be looking for. They may be looking for, can you handle the stress of the job? Can you handle the people you'd be working with? So they're looking for those things. So they are looking for that, and answers that go along with that. But that's really the main thing there. And then, do you want the job? People hire people that want to work there. So if you really want to work there compared to someone else, and they really believe you want to work there, they're much more likely to hire you than if you don't appear if you just appear like you don't want the job. I gave that example earlier in this webinar when I was talking about interviewing someone who was very old that wanted the job, and it was a mistake not hiring them. People that want a job very much, or the firm is in some sense aspirational for them or something along those lines, or they're moving up, or the job's a really good match for them, are much more likely to get hired than people that may be non-committal. Being managed, I'm sure you know what that means, but if you look at any employer that you've ever worked with, you can probably notice that employers are constantly pushing people out that can't be managed, or people that can't be managed are always leaving. And so being able to be managed is very difficult. Oftentimes in summer associate classes, there's always one or two people that look like they can't be managed. It's almost what the test is of a summer associate job, is they're looking to see if the person can be managed. But even young attorneys can't be managed. So being managed means, will you come into the office when you're asked to? Will you do the things we ask you to? Will you do things like that? Commit to the job basically means, are you going to stick around on the job, or are you just going to look for something else? Is this the kind of job that you want? And then, do we like you? Basically means that, do they like you? So if an interview isn't going well, typically the best thing I think you can do is often just come across as likable. And there's a lot of ways to do that. But if an interview is not going well, many times the best thing to do is to figure out how to get people to like you. And one way I recommend doing that is often asking people questions about themselves, pictures, like different sorts of things, and getting people on your side. But these are really the questions that people are asking. There's articles about this that we provide to employers. So employers read these articles many times before, or have read them in the past. And I give webinars for employers about the same information. But these are questions that they're all asking, and especially the more senior ones. Doing really well at any of these can really help you. So just think about if you were hiring someone. If you were hiring someone, the first thing you'd want to see is if they could do the work. Once you realize they could do the work, though, you'd want to hire someone that really wanted the job. Then you'd hire someone that you believe could be managed, and then would commit to it, and so forth. So these are the questions that every interviewer is asking. Doing really well in any of these can always turn things around for you and can be very helpful. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, how much personal information should I provide during the interview? For example, sports interest. So it's okay to talk about sports and other things that you like during the interview. It doesn't mean that it's going to disqualify you from anything. If you like sports, there's nothing wrong with liking sports. If you like any type of hobby that you like, or things that you like doing, is also very good. And that's not really that personal. Personal information would include things that are just very personal in nature. I talked about a lot of them up here, anything where the people are in sides and that sort of thing. But yeah, you can provide personal information. There's nothing wrong with it. I just would be careful about volunteering personal information, because there is certain types of personal information where if people hear that this sort of information, hear this about you, it could potentially flip them to not liking you. So what kind of information would that be? Sports is not really one where people are going to dislike you because you like sports, but anything that's very personal in nature, which would be things like religion, politics, sex, health, all those sorts of things are things that you may have done in the past. That many times can hurt you, and so you need to be many times careful about that. Okay, next question. How long should a good interview last? Okay, interviews are typically structured to last a certain length of time, and most of them are a half hour. Sometimes they're longer. There's a couple things. Let me just get here to fix this. A couple things to remember about interviews. So most, because attorneys are paid by the hour and have to bill hours and accumulate hours, most of them are interested in do not want to spend a lot of time on interviews. Contrary to what you may think, or a lot of times most attorneys may enjoy doing interviews, but they do not often enjoy the interruption, and they may have other things they want to get to. Time interviewing you is not billable hour time, and it's detracting from them seeing their families and all sorts of things. It's not to say that it's wrong to do an interview, but taking more time in an interview than you believe you should can often upset people a little bit. One thing I will say about a good interview is if it's a good interview, many times the interviewer will be having a great time talking to you and will enjoy talking to you. And then the interview may go longer, and that's actually a good sign. So if an interview goes longer, or the person wants to spend additional time with you, then that's a good sign. It could be a longer interview, but I typically would recommend not trying to keep interviews going longer than they should, because most of the time attorneys are they don't want to spend a lot of time on interviews. So just think about your position. It's another question. Is it okay to ask about benefits? I think I answered this earlier, but asking about benefits is probably not a good idea during the interview. I would just focus on the position. In most cases, you can find a lot of information about the compensation online, or you'll find it after getting the job offer, or sometimes before the job offer. They may ask you what you're making. I would be very careful with that. There's a lot of ways to answer that question. People will ask about how much you want to make when you're interviewing with a firm. Sometimes you can, if you're making a certain amount and you want to make the same amount, you can tell them that. If you don't want to make the same amount and you don't really care, you can just say, I want to get paid what everyone else is getting paid, or I want to feel like I'm being compensated fairly based on what the firm is paying or what the employer is paying. And that's really often the best way to handle that. So law firms all the time will use your current compensation as a way to disqualify you from making offers or for interviewing you. So law firms several times a day will ask me, what is the person making? Or what do they expect to make? And so we have to be obviously our job is to get you a job. So we have to be very careful how we answer that question, but we also have to be honest. So law firms, especially smaller law firms, do not want to waste their time if they don't pay very well interviewing people or watching your reactions when they tell you that their compensation is half of what a major firm is. They need to believe that you'll take the job. So this is just stuff to be very careful about in jobs. And obviously you have to look out for your best interest, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to make as much money as you possibly can. So I don't think if that's what you're looking for, but at the same time, it's not the kind of thing I recommend focusing on right away in your interviews. One second here. Should I take notes during an interview? Yes, you can take notes if you like. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense to take notes. I think many times some people do take notes during an interview. It can detract from you connecting with the interviewer. It's often, there's nothing that the interviewer is really going to say that you're not going to remember that's that important. If they ask you to call someone or do something, or you need to take notes, then you can note that down. So it is a good idea to always have your resume and references and other things with you when you go into an interview. But taking notes is a little odd sometimes. It also makes people uncomfortable when the employer's taking notes. I don't think you need to take notes during an interview, but I think you should be ready to write things down if you need to during an interview. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Let's see here. Let's see. Okay, if I really want to shine during an interview, what are some steps to do this very well? Let me see here. Okay, I'll just be as direct with this as I can. Obviously, if there's an interview that's very important to you, then one of the most important things to do is to research the firm and understand what's going on in the firm beforehand and what would be like working there beforehand and being excited about it. But the next thing that I would recommend, I'll tell you a quick story. When I was growing up, I used to swim like competitively, and there was a guy that was my next door neighbor that always used to beat me in every match. And it was strange because during practices, I was much better than him. And then one day I went over to his house, I don't know, because he was right next door before we were getting ready to go to swim meet. And he looked like he was sleeping. And I was like, "What are you doing?" And I woke him up. He said, "Oh, I'm practicing this visualization exercise. I'm visualizing winning the meet." And he always won these meets. And I'm like, "Wow. And you do that before every meet?" He said, "Yeah." And he became a big time college swimmer at the University of Michigan. And so I think sometimes visualizing and spending some time thinking about how things are going to go well, what you're going to do, and psyching yourself up for an interview is very important. And I think it works. I think that if you concentrate on what can go right, what you could do, and visualize everything before the interview and just rehearse it in your mind, that would be something that I would recommend. A lot of people do that. Athletes do that. A lot of professionals do that. I remember once I was getting ready to travel somewhere with this person, this famous motivational speaker, and the person was talking to themselves and jumping up and down, and we were getting on a plane going to, I don't know, we were going to Australia or something, and the person was just rehearsing in his mind over and over again, and to have it to be very successful at it. And this is something that a lot of very successful people do. I don't know about talking to yourself, but just going and visualizing and thinking about how you're going to do well and stuff, I think can be very important if you want to do well. Okay. Is it a good idea to interview even if I don't want the position just to get more experience? Yes. So I think any interview you get, it's always a good idea to go on the interview. Now, if you really don't want the position, I don't know why that would be. It could be that the compensation is much lower than you'd ever expect, and if that's the reason, or you never would work there, you never would work in that city. But every interview is an opportunity to network. And so networking is something that is very important. So it's an opportunity to network. It's an opportunity to learn about different firms, about different people, to practice, to get exposed to questions you normally wouldn't get exposed to, all sorts of things. So I think going to interviews are very smart. Now, and you don't always know if you're not going to take the position, because you never know what's going to happen. And so you may find yourself going on an interview and thinking you aren't going to want to work there, and yet then realizing when you're interviewing what a great opportunity is, or how many great things are possibly why it would be a good place for you to work. So I think even if you're not sure if you want the position, I think going on interviews can be a very smart thing. How do you respond to the question of what is your salary expectation? Okay, so this particular question, another good question. Just give me a second here. I think I answered this in the past. What I believe with candidates is that, especially for young attorneys, your first 3 to 5 years of practice are really not about your income. I know you think they are, but they're really not about your income. They're about your experience and what you're being exposed to, and the work and the type of attorney that work is going to make you become. Honestly, people do not really know what they're doing after 1, 2 years, even 3 years. After 5 years, you know enough that you can be competent, but it's really not about income. I know it seems like it is, because for many people, you can make a lot of money and you think you have student loans to pay, but you're talking about a career that could go 40 or 50 years. And only a small percentage of it is starting off in a firm. So if a firm's asking you about your income and the salary expectation, that means that they probably are not a high paid firm. And so that's the answer you give. You say, I realize as a young attorney that it's more important for me to get experience and worry about my income. I certainly would like to make the same amount of other people in my class year and have the expectation to increase my income. But my biggest concern is the quality of experience that I get at this point. And I'm certainly willing to trade income for that, because I feel like the more I learn now, the better off I'll be in the long run. And that's important. Sometimes people that go to major law firms don't get exposed to a lot of things. And they may just do nothing but discovery their first 3 or 4 years, when the people at peer firms are going to court and doing trials. And so it really depends on you. But really, your first 3 to 5 years are not about income. I know you think they are, and I'm probably not going to convince anybody of otherwise. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to. But you should not be worrying about your income very much your first 3 to 5 years of practice because it's about the experience. So that's how I would respond. If they ask you what you want to make, you probably should say what I want to be paid, what other people here are being paid in an amount that's fair for the type of practice or something along those lines. But being able to see what they're really asking you there, they're saying, can you be managed? Are you going to accept the money we're giving you, which you might not? Are you going to commit? And they're kind of asking, those are some of the questions that they're asking when they ask that question. One second. A lot of people ask about salary, so I think that's got that. Can you discuss the benefits of working in a boutique firm as well as your ability to move to a floor firm after an experience? Pull it up. Okay, so there's a couple articles I've written on BCG, the benefits of working in a boutique firm and then the benefits of working in a large firm. But if you work at a boutique firm, there's definitely a lot of benefits of that. One of the main things is training. So boutique firms typically will, with a few attorneys that are good. So if you'll often get with close training. So you'll typically get better training in a boutique firm, meaning you'll work directly with someone on all aspects of whatever you're doing, meaning instead of just working on a discrete aspect of a case or a matter, you'll work on lots of different aspects of the matter, which is very helpful, meaning you'll be exposed to, if you're a litigator, instead of working on discovery, and you may do depositions or you may you'll just get more experience doing different things. So that's one benefit. The other benefit of working in a boutique firm is often it's a good place you get more client contact. So that can be very helpful. You can often boutiques are called boutiques traditionally because they have a specialty. There's boutiques that do IP, there's boutiques that do litigation, there's boutiques that do ERISA and tax. And so you'll get often very good exposure, healthcare to your practice area in a lot of depth. And you can then take that expertise to a larger or better firm later. Boutiques also I think the training can be very good. Even sometimes the compensation's lower, but you're going to get more exposure to whatever it is you're working on. And yes, you can definitely move from a boutique to a 3 or 4 firm after working in a boutique. What happens to most attorneys is a lot of people will start out at large law firms and then they'll get sick of working in a large law firm and they'll start leaving. And large law firms always want to hire people that are excited to move up, meaning people that really want to work there, that have a lot of enthusiasm. And that enthusiasm essentially means a lot of hours that they're going to bill and trying to get ahead. So law firms always hire people, big law firms from boutiques in the future. If you start out a boutique, say in Silicon Valley doing corporate or litigation, and later on you want to move to a much bigger firm that has a national name, you can, or corporate or whatever your practice area is. An interesting fact is most patent attorneys start out in boutiques. The reason they start out in boutiques is they typically do not meet the grade cutoffs for working in major firms when they're coming out of school. But then when they get the training in a boutique and work on a bunch of different things, when they're moving as a lateral, the firms no longer care about their grades. And they can move to a bigger firm. And that's what most of them do, because most patent attorneys, for example, major in science, so they don't go to the best law schools, so they don't have the best grades. And because oftentimes they're working while they're in school, they often don't get the best grades while they're in school. So in law school, so then they go to boutiques but then move from boutiques to larger firms later. I think, by the way, going to a boutique is often a very good experience for young attorneys because you will get exposed to a lot of different things early on, and it can often put you very far ahead of other attorneys. Most boutique firms are also started by people from large law firms that broke off because they wanted to feel independent or have their own firm or take clients, who knows. But often you'll get a lot of the same type of training. You'll also be exposed to an entrepreneurial environment earlier in your career, meaning someone trying to run a business and paid staff and bring in clients and all that you might not normally get. So you get to go see the firm try to bring in clients. You'll get to see them make mistakes. You'll get to see lots of things you wouldn't see, and then you can always move later on. So I do feel that it can be a very good idea to go to a boutique even earlier in your career. And if that's the only job you get, you should feel good about it. Or if you don't get a job in a big firm, because you can almost always, especially if it's a well-respected boutique, move to a big firm later. I've seen people come out of fourth tier law schools and get jobs with one attorney or two or three attorney firm in a very discrete practice area like healthcare or something, and wind up at some of the largest law firms in the world based on that training. You can definitely define coming out of a boutique. Okay, so here's a question. I went in-house this is a good question. Here, give me 1 second. I went in-house for 2 years during COVID because I had no other option. I'm currently interviewing for law firms and don't know how to explain without giving a bad impression the reason why I switched from law firm to in-house and now back to a law firm. Okay, if you're interviewing with law firms, that's great. So that means that there's really nothing wrong with your background, that law firms are interested in hiring you. So explaining going in-house can be difficult. So again, back to these reasons, law firms are often wondering, will you commit to the job long-term? So they feel like if you went in-house, that you may not be someone that's going to commit to a job long-term. And there's nothing wrong with going in-house from the way you're talking about things. But what I would suggest saying is not that you had no other options, but that my firm slowed down or didn't have any work. And this offer came along and I took it, but I really miss working in a law firm. These are the things I miss about a law firm. And it would be the sophistication of the work, the new matters, the working for clients, the challenge of building a book, all the different types of advantages that law firms have over in-house jobs. There's an article that I wrote called Why Going In-House is the Dumbest Mistake an Attorney Can Make. It's something like that. I'm not sure that's the title, but something along those lines. And that article could be helpful for you just to understand some of the drawbacks of going in-house. But if you want to be in a law firm, I would just say it was a mistake. I want to go back to a law firm. I want to be in a law firm. This is what I like. If you're it depends on the geographic area you're in. So if you're in a geographic area without a lot of law firms and you took a job in-house, and that, I don't know what the reasons are, but typically stressing why you want to be in a law firm as opposed to in-house. There's another question here about going in-house. Let me see. There's some funny questions coming up after this one too. I love it. Let me see. Okay, this next question, does working in-house give you something positive that law firms might value in order to hire you? It depends on the in-house job you take. There's a bunch of reasons that in-house can be negative for people, but does it give you something positive that law firms might value in order to hire you? It depends on your practice area. It also depends on the type of in-house job you had and a bunch of other related things. It also depends on whether or not those contacts that you got in-house could be brought over as clients to the law firm, a bunch of other things. But going in-house is not necessarily all negative. But the problem with going in-house is that it's just most in-house counsel do not do work that's as sophisticated as their outside law firms do. Most in-house, they typically become experts in not doing work and experts in giving work to other people. So being successful as an in-house, and then they're typically not specialists, but they typically become more generalist. And so the way to really emphasize the benefit of your in-house experience is to try to convince firms that you really got a lot of specialist experience in your in-house job that's relevant to your practice area, that you worked harder in-house or than you did in a law firm, that you miss a law firm, that you might have client contacts that you could bring over from the in-house job to the law firm, that working in-house convinced you that you never want to work in-house again, that you'd only want to work in a law firm, all those sorts of things. So you can talk about the commitment it gave you to wanting to, anything that really makes it look like the in-house job is something that convinced you that a law firm is better or that gave you skills would help you. So that's how I would recommend with that. Okay, this next question, is it okay to flirt with someone in an interview if you like the person? Not. So this is the funny question I'd say. I've seen this happen before, so it certainly happens. And maybe you have to be very careful about what is flirting and what is not flirting. But certainly smiling and that sort of thing is probably okay. But you do want to be professional and at the same time mildly approachable and likable. But you definitely don't, I wouldn't recommend flirting an interview. No one wants to hire someone if they feel like it's going to get them in trouble later on, regardless of who you're interviewing with. The interviewer, if they think you're flirting, it's going to probably not go over well. So I would definitely, or could, who knows? But regardless, it's just not the right way to think about things. So I would try to avoid that. You definitely do not want to go into interviews with the idea of meeting romantic partners. It's a job. You have to be very careful. And frankly, I can't think of any way to get into more trouble than to getting into anything related to, personal relationships and so forth like that during any type of interview, because it can definitely, now, if you don't want to work there, that's a whole separate question and you have to use your judgment, but I don't think any sense of the imagination want to flirt during an interview, which is kind of a funny question, but I've seen it happen before, so it's not inappropriate, but I think it's going to make people very uncomfortable. Is it okay to avoid a question related to sexuality during an interview? Sure. So if someone asks you questions about your sexuality, I don't think there's any reason you have to answer that. And I would think that there's obviously something wrong with the interviewer and you may not want to work someplace if people are asking you those kind of questions during an interview. First of all, it's none of their business. And second of all, it's not. These kind of questions are just not appropriate. If flirting in interviews and you're there to get a job, you're not there to get a romantic partner. You can certainly be friendly with people and smile and make eye contact. And that's not flirting, but flirting is, I guess there's different levels of it. But yeah, you don't want to answer questions about sexuality during interviews. And there are all sorts of people that do this kind of stuff. I'm not saying that these questions are out of line. I mean, I'm saying these questions are out of line, but I'm not saying that people don't ask them. Most of the time, people that ask these kind of questions end up getting in trouble later in their careers. And I just can't tell you every firm gets involved in lawsuits and all sorts of things. And if this is happening at a firm you're interviewing with, it's probably not a good thing because the firm's going to get in trouble later and you don't want any part of it. If it's a large law firm, it's probably, how can you show that you can be managed in an interview? So the way you can show you can be managed in an interview is really to show the employer that you're here to do what they need done. You're good at following instructions. You're a team player, all those sorts of things. So what happens in a lot of, especially now, is you may be watching, one example would be, what is Elon Musk? What is he doing at Tesla? Or not Tesla, I mean, business. Twitter. What is he doing at Twitter now? You start there, and your first day, you fire your CEO and your general counsel and a bunch of people. And then the next day you fire half the staff. And then a few days later, you tell everyone that they have to go into the office and they have to work harder than they've ever worked. What is he doing? He's basically getting rid of all the fluff and making sure that the people that are there are committed and can follow directions and can be managed. Meaning, up until that point, his opinion probably was that people weren't willing to be managed and were just managing themselves and doing what they want and making a lot of money. And this is a billionaire or the richest man in the world doing this. So there's probably some method to this madness. I'm sure people will question him and he's doing what other people are probably afraid to do. But this is an example of trying to manage a large group of people by sending a message. So how do you send a message that you can be managed? You say things that are related to how often do I need to be in the office? Or people ask you, you wouldn't ask how often you need to be in the office, but if people ask you, you have a problem working in the office? You say, absolutely not. I'll do whatever, if this is what you mean. Do you have a problem? Anything that shows that you do what is asked of you and you're willing to follow directions and you're willing to respect authority and all those sorts of things will show that you can be managed. And what's interesting to understand about being managed is there are people that are against it, and that's fine. You don't have to, every type of job, you don't have to be managed. There are jobs that allow a lot of independence, but for the most part, if you're working for someone else, whether you're the president of the United States or you're whoever, you're being managed by other people to some extent. I think most presidents are managed by a lot of other people to some extent. So are most executives and so are most partners in law firms. But being managed means basically helping the company or the law firm do what they need, following instructions, not getting in the way of things getting done, being committed to the law firm and and not a troublemaker. And all organizations are constantly going through a process where they're flushing people out that are not willing to be managed or not following instructions, and bringing people in that will do that. And that's one reason why they like hiring people from smaller firms like boutiques and bringing them into larger firms, because what happens is a lot of times people become stale in large firms and then they bring in hungrier people, and that helps the whole system. But being able to be managed is very important. So you can say things like, "I'd never like to turn down an assignment. I'd like to be in the office early because I can get a lot of stuff done then, and then I can be more responsive to assignments during the day." There's all sorts of ways to show it. But once people believe that you're able to be managed, you're much more likely to be hired by anyone. And I'm sure when you look around, in every law firm, there's always people, lots of them, that can't be managed. And so those people typically leave, or they're asked to leave, or they're unhappy, and you just have to be managed. And one thing I would say, if you're unhappy being managed, and there's nothing wrong with being unhappy being managed, people that are unhappy being managed start their own companies and do all sorts of things. But if you're unhappy being managed, you should often look at the organization you're in. So if you're at a law firm that's been around for 100 plus years, they obviously have something figured out, and they probably know how to manage things in a fairly decent, not perfect way, but a fairly decent way. And so you should sometimes revert to that. And the law firm model, for the most part, does work for law firms. So you need to stay in it. Okay, so here's another. When I say to avoid personal questions, what is the choosing not to answer questions at the interview? Yeah, so you don't have to answer every question you're asked. And again, like the skill of not answering questions is the same thing that a lawyer would do in court. So if a lawyer or with a client, so if you choose not to answer a question, that's fine. But you're going to be evaluated on how well you don't answer the question. So if you turn it around and make the person that asked the question feel badly, that's probably not a good idea. If you directly say, "I'm not going to answer this question," that's going to make the person feel badly and defensive. So the way not to answer the question would be to talk many times without giving a response, and then just go from there. But in most cases, if somebody asks you a question that's very personal in nature, and then you don't answer it, and they ask it to you again, that's not good. And if the law firm doesn't make you an offer because of that, I don't know what to tell you, but most of the time, I don't think the law firm HR people would appreciate hearing something like that. So the person that's doing this is actually putting themselves in a lot worse situation than you are, because I can imagine in this environment, especially, that someone that does something like this could be in fairly serious trouble for asking certain types of questions. And I guess it's just not acceptable. Okay, what is a good weakness to say in law firm interviews? The good weaknesses are always things about in interviewing and different, let me see here. Be things about your strengths. So the weaknesses are always, I work too hard. I'm a perfectionist. I commit to things. I always try to make my bosses happy with my work. Anything like that I stress too much about job after work, and it's hard for me to sleep. Just anything that relates to you being very good at your job are always good weaknesses. Good weaknesses are not things like I'm lazy or like that, or I don't pay enough attention to details, but anything that relates to your strengths and realization that you have strengths is always important. There's a lot of questions. I really appreciate all these questions today. This is freaking amazing. A lot of questions. Okay, let me see here. Okay, what is the best color to wear to law firm interviews? So most people have, you see here, and I don't really know how to answer that question, but what I do know is that you definitely do not want to wear nothing too bright. And most people have colors that are good for them. I don't know how it works, but it has to do with your skin tone, and you can wear colors that work for your skin tone. And there's a way to choose your colors, and the skin tone or hair color, I don't know what it is. And so you can do that, or typically things that are conservative, which would be like a gray or blue suit and that sort of thing. So those are how I think about that. But typically you don't want to wear anything that's going to stick out and be too noticeable or too unusual, which would be very bright colors and things. Okay, let me see. What are the best negotiation strategies for law firm job offers? Okay, the best negotiation strategy typically, and depending on the type of offer that you receive. So there's a bunch of different factors related to job offer and negotiation strategies. And you have to think to yourself about what you want to negotiate. So sometimes people want to negotiate how many days a week they have to be in the office. Other times people want to negotiate their pay. Other times people want to negotiate. Sometimes people even are able to negotiate how long it will be till they're considered for partner, all sorts of types of things. It really depends on the firm that you're interviewing with, that you're negotiating with. The largest law firms often will have at least at the associate level, a lot of stuff is almost written in stone. And so if you're hired, they expect you to follow along with that. If it's a smaller firm, or you're typically going to have a lot more negotiating room. And then, of course, partners can have an incredible amount of negotiation room, even with the largest firms. If you're trying to negotiate a job offer, often having another offer that is better in some terms, or telling them, if you have another offer, I'm considering something else, and this is what I'd like to get, or this is what I'm currently making. Is it possible to match that? I really like the firm are often the best strategies. Negotiating from where you're at now or where you could be to the smartest things, and that's for money. And then other aspects can be useful too. So you just have to get a sense of what's negotiable. I will say that even with the largest law firms, a lot of stuff is negotiable. There's things you can negotiate, like bar stipends, even if you're moving from out of state, you can negotiate bonuses. If you're leaving a firm and you may have gotten a bonus, but if you didn't leave, you can negotiate that sometimes. You can negotiate time off to study for the bar if you have to move states and take the bar. You can negotiate many things. So what I would recommend doing would be writing down all the points that you think are important. You can negotiate a moving allowance. You can negotiate paid time off to move, just different things sometimes. It depends on what you're thinking. Now, that's not to say that all firms will do these things. Typically, you have what are, I would say, very established firms, which should be your large institution with the largest firms with most history, which, who knows, your AmLaw, your biggest and oldest firms. And those firms typically will have very strict and defined things. And then you have less established or smaller to less established, and they may not have established. So typically you're going to get the least negotiation here, for at least at the associate level, least to negotiation to the most. So what happens is, just from a business standpoint, is that law firms are businesses. And what happens is, as a business matures, businesses become much more set in their ways, and they have all these procedures basically to accommodate everything that's coming at them. And so the most established firms typically will not have as much negotiation, but the less established will. If you're trying to work at a smaller firm, you may actually have a lot more negotiation leverage than you realize. But even the very established firms will a lot of times negotiate things. What I would recommend, though, in terms of negotiation is, if you do too much negotiation, it can leave a very bad taste in people's mouth and upset them before you even start. So you need to pick your battles wisely and be careful, but because you do want to look like you're someone that can be managed. I've seen firms, and I hate to say this, it hasn't happened very often, but when people try to negotiate too much, they're just like, listen, I can see where this is going to go in the future, and we just don't want anything to do with you. And now, has that happened? I don't think that's happened in a couple of years, but I did see that happen with a smaller firm that was run by one individual not too long ago, a couple of years ago. So it can happen. Okay. Wow. What can in-house counsel do to keep their skills sharpened? The problem with going in-house is that most in-house counsels are going to be, again, generalist, and will refer a lot of work outside. It's in their best interest to refer work out to other attorneys, because many times they can't do the work themselves, or they don't want to do it themselves, or they can get their employer to pay for it. And so they become kind of experts in that. And that's just how it works. It's always worked that way as far as I'm aware. It doesn't work that way everywhere. Some firms do their own patents and their own litigation, but in order to keep your skills sharpened, what I would recommend is basically doing as much of the work as you possibly can yourself. I was talking to an attorney at a big firm in New York not too long ago. I think it was Latham, and they told me someone from in-house, and it was their client, and they hired him because he was just so freaking all over it, like doing everything himself and a perfectionist. And they said they never hired someone like that out of an in-house job. And this is in the New York office. So if you are very gung-ho in-house and you're doing a lot of the work yourself and you're doing a very good job and you're impressing the attorneys that are working for you with the quality of your work, they will often be more than happy to hire you or speak very highly of you and even recommend you to other firms. So that's how I would think about doing that. Let me see. Okay. Okay, let me see here. This is a good question. Should I contact the recruiter in a law firm job interview and ask them why I fail? That's a good question. So I think that there are some actually very nice recruiting coordinators in law firms, some very nice people. And they would be sometimes are happy to discuss this sort of thing. But the problem with any time someone does that is if you make one person didn't like you and then you talk to them and they basically don't tell you that person's name, which they probably wouldn't, but they would say things, they imply something, then you may contact that person. And so law firms the recruiting coordinators inside of law firms are often very nervous to do that, and they won't tell you why you failed. What I would just take away from all of this is that typically if you don't get the job when you interview, there's a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is just that someone better came along. The person could be better because they liked them more. It could be better because they look more committed. It could be better because they're experienced. You don't know. Someone better came along. That's the first reason. Other times they may not hire you because they no longer have a need or they're concerned about the economy and things like that. So worrying about that or thinking about things that way is also another way to deal with it. But typically the answer is that you're not the right person. It's not that you failed. There are firms, by the way, that may interview a lot of people. They may interview 10 people for one job. So it's not that you failed. It's just that there was someone else that they like better. And there's nothing for you to really worry about. I mean, it is something that people get very upset about, especially if it's one of the only interviews they get or the only interview of the type of firm they want to work at. So it's nothing to really worry too much about. But if you want, some firms may be willing to talk to you about that. But in general, no means no. And there's really no way to get around that. And it's unfortunate. And most of these places you can also apply to again. I've seen people interview and then get jobs at the same firm that they got rejected at later. But you certainly don't want to apply to that firm every 6 months. You want to change something about your background before you come back, because most law firms do keep records of their previous applicants. Okay, let's see here. If you interview for a position with a law firm, let me see here. Give me one second. Okay. Oh, sorry, I just didn't cover everything. Okay. If you interview for a position with a law firm but did not receive contact information from some reviewers, accept some thank you letters, even though you already sent an email thanking the interviewer whose email address was obtained. Sorry, no, some there. Oh, you mean, I'm assuming you want to send 2 thank you letters? I don't think you need to send 2 thank you letters, but and there's this thank you letters, even though you already sent an email thanking the interviewers whose email address was obtained. Some of the interviewers. Yeah, yes, you can send people, by the way. So with the thank you letters, how does that work? Typically what happens is, and this is at all firms, there's just a quick form that people fill out after they speak to you. And typically they'll do it almost contemporaneously. So they'll talk to you and they'll fill out the form and submit it. So sending the thank you letter often isn't going to do you much good, especially with associates. Sometimes it could help with partners and especially ones that are in charge, and they will make a decision based on that. But the thank you letters, again, many times aren't going to make much of a difference. But you can certainly send but I would not send an email address and an email and a letter. I guess you could. You can always call the firm and just talk to the front desk and say, I wanted to send a thank you note. Could I do that? And I would just maybe talk to the receptionist. I don't know that you want to bother the recruiting coordinator about it, but yeah, that's one way to do it. Let me see here. Should I write a thank you email after receiving a job rejection email? No, I don't think. If you're rejected from a job, I don't think you need to send a thank you letter. The firms receive so many applicants, it's very difficult for them to remember people. And if you apply to a firm, one of the things to think about. So at BCG, for example, like we have, just like any employment we have a lot of resumes of people. And because someone isn't appropriate for us at one point in time, doesn't mean that they're not going to, someone could apply for a job and then, or apply to work with us. And 3 days later, and we could say we can't work with you right now, or we don't have any openings. And then 3 days later, there could be something perfect for them. So it depends on the firm. So firms aren't going to remember a thank you email. There's so many applicants they receive that there's no reason to, and you don't need to respond to a rejection email. A rejection email is just what it is. And just keep in mind, if you were a law firm, they receive, most law firms, a lot of applicants. So they don't really have the time to remember you or anything. It's nothing just personal. It's just your background and whether or not it matches what they need, or even if sometimes you're rejected just because they've already started interviewing people and they don't have time to bring in more people. And there's all sorts of things. You can't question too much why you're getting rejected. So, let's see, a lot of questions. Let's see here. So give me 1 second here. Sorry. Okay. When applying for a job, how will they assess courses that were only available on a pass-fail basis? What can be done to emphasize these courses when submitting an application during the interview process? Okay. One of the things about pass-fail is that it's actually pretty smart. If you think you're not going to do well in a course and you've done well in other courses, taking a pass-fail course, if you have that option, I think is a very smart thing, because it can certainly raise your grade point average. Law firms are not, contrary to what you may think, they're not studying your grades and stuff very carefully when you apply. They may look at how well you did in your law school compared to other people in your law school. Some law firms have cutoffs for different law schools, but most of them are not studying your grades very carefully. But just as most law schools are not studying your grades, they're looking at what your grade point average is. That's it. They're not saying, oh, but this grade was in music versus, unfortunately, I know a lot of people in the admissions community, and it's unfortunate, but that's how it works, is it's your grade point average. And then same thing for law firms. Law firms are concerned about, if you look really good on paper because of your grades, that's great, but they're not studying your grades. So I don't think you need to talk about, all this stuff is important to you because you're into it, and the pass fail and that point, but it's not, the law firms aren't really that concerned about whether or not a class is pass fail or not. And yeah. Okay. What are the chances of graduates from, I'm assuming you mean law schools, lower tier law firms, getting lower tier law schools, getting hired by prestigious legal firms? What qualities do employers look for in applicants? So if you didn't go to a great law school, then you have a couple of different options. One of them is to start at a smaller firm and work your way up. And then the other is to do very well. Regardless of where you went to law school, if it's a ABA accredited law school, people from all ABA accredited law schools are working in the largest law firms. If you do very well there, you can get a job there early in your career. If you didn't, it's going to be a question of your practice area and the location that you're in. If you want to work in the biggest law firms, typically it's a little bit easier in smaller markets rather than larger markets. But and it depends on your practice area. But if you didn't go to the best law school, it's definitely not going to prevent you from getting a job in a major law firm. It may right away when you get out of school, but people can always move later. Typically, this is just a piece of advice I'm going to give it. It's a funny piece of advice, but it's something I've noticed. People that didn't go to the best law schools that want to work in the biggest firms often go to practice areas that other attorneys do not want to go into, that are not practice area, or that are not as desirable. I don't know what those would be, but it could be, and I'm not going to even say what those are because I don't want to say bad things about practice areas, but going to do a transactional practice area is often a very good idea. Transactional practice areas are things like corporate, bankruptcy, corporate, real estate, things like that. It's not as important often where you went to law school, trademark, in a lot of transactional practice areas than it may be in litigation. Don't ask me why, but large law firms typically do care a lot about your law school and your performance and clerkships and things for litigation, but less so about transactional. And the other benefit about transactional is you're competing with fewer people. So if you want to be a corporate attorney or you want to be one of these things and you go to work at a smaller firm and you get experience, years later, if you do get good experience and the economy is right, you could move into a big firm. So that's one of the things I would recommend. Okay. All right, let me see here. I think I got all these questions. There's a lot of stuff. Okay, here's someone who says, I'm not going to use their name in their profile. So I'm just going to. Let me see. So this is the first question someone asked today, so I'm going to. It says, I'm in a weird situation. I'm in a 3L year and IP litigation at Latham. Oh, great. Nice job. But have a history of patent prosecution at UPSTO and 3 years in a law firm, patent engineer before law school. I just passed the patent bar. I want to develop a portfolio of work in case not limiting litigation. I don't expect this to be the case, but I want to practically know how to use firms since I would only have about 6 months until I would have to leave to take the bar and switch again to litigation. Okay, so what happens with this is a good question. So what happens with patent prosecutors is patent prosecution. This is for people that don't know what it is. Patent prosecution is writing patents and then defending them or in front of the patent office or trying to overturn other people's patents that may be issued against your patent with a patent office. Typically what happens is when an attorney comes out of school, they will often become a patent prosecutor first, and sometimes they've been a patent prosecutor while they were in school. And then other times an attorney will be a patent, will go into patent litigation. That is a patent, will go into patent litigation first. People that go into patent litigation, typically these days, it didn't used to be the case, but they'll have backgrounds and they'll often have a patent bar because it just looks better for the clients and it enables them to understand stuff. So what I would say, let me just see. If you're a 3L, you really should not be using a legal recruiter at this point. You can certainly use a legal recruiter when you get more experience. And then you're going into patent litigation, so you can certainly do that without being a patent prosecutor. One of the things that happens because patent prosecution is so technical, it's very difficult for patent prosecutors to bill a lot of hours, and because it just takes a lot of concentration. And it's also the type of work that people typically don't want to do forever. And there's also a lot more money in doing patent litigation than there is patent prosecution. The reason that patent litigation, the cases just can go on forever, and while you're billing $1,000 an hour, whatever it is, to the client, as long as the patent litigation case is going on. In patent prosecution, what's happening these days is a lot of the patents are being done in China or in India or by kind of patent mills where it's much less expensive. And so the people that are doing them, the cost of patent prosecution is going down. A lot of firms are doing them for fixed prices, and the patent litigation is continually going. It's not as active as it was several years ago, but it's still very active. So patent litigation is actually probably a better practice area to be into than prosecution. And especially if you can get a job out of law school doing patent litigation with a patent background, that's extremely impressive. And especially having the patent bar in addition. So that gives you will give you a lot of employment stability. And you can almost always go back to patent prosecution later. If you do want to do not like litigation and want to go into patent prosecution, you can later, but it's probably important. I don't think Latham is not going to give you a lot of exposure to prosecution, but you'll certainly learn about it. I would recommend probably sticking with the litigation as long as you can to see if it's something that you're interested in the long run. Okay, thanks for all the questions. That was a lot of questions, and I appreciate them. I hope everyone has a good holiday, and then we'll be back again next week. And again, I appreciate all the questions. These webinars will go up also. There will be a recording of them, and they'll go on the VCG site. And this will be on the site hopefully in the next week or so. So thanks again, everyone, for being on the call.